Good afternoon, everyone. Warm welcome to Multiculturalism and Migration Observatory seminar, which today will be devoted to the theme of mobility and immobility of international students in times of pandemic. My name is Konrad Pędziwiatr, and together with Dobrosława Wiktor Mach, will be leading today's seminar. The event is scheduled for up to 2 hours and will include a short intro and then 4 talks from our fantastic speakers and Q&A session. Before we start, let me just very briefly talk you through the housekeeping. The event is being recorded and we'll try to share the film, the recording on our YouTube channel after. Your microphones are muted and your video is turned down to avoid disruptions. And for the Q&A, we will invite you to unmute yourself and to turn on your video to ask questions directly if you wish so. You can also, if you prefer so, ask the questions in the chat box. This video, sound, all will be saved as part of the live recording. If you do not wish to appear in the recording, please use private chat to ask questions. Today, Multiculturalism and Migration Observatory seminar, as I mentioned, is happening just a few days before the inauguration of the new academic year in many European countries. It will focus on the mobility and immobility of international students, those students who are often described as super mobile and who have been particularly strongly affected by the lockdowns and all sorts of immobility regulations, if I may say. There are, as globally as you know, there are over 5 million of such students around the world, and in Poland, according to the latest statistics, there are almost 80,000 international students studying in Poland. This is a huge change when we compare it from the situation a decade ago. In 2005, there were less than 10,000 students, so it's a really big change. I wouldn't like to take too much time in the introduction. We have 4 fantastic speakers, and I would like to first introduce the first 2 speakers and then give them the floor to present their own research on the subject of today's seminar. So the first 2 speakers are Ewa Krzaklewska, who is an assistant professor at the Institute of Sociology at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, Poland, and her research interests relate to youth sociology, including transition to adulthood, youth mobility, youth work and policy, as well as gender equality and family studies. She has been studying youth mobility for several years, starting from 2005, Erasmus Student Network Survey on Erasmus student experience. She will present research together, which she carried out together with Karolina Czerska-Shaw, who holds a PhD in sociology from Jagiellonian University in Krakow, and her research interests include migration and integration policies and practices, civic education and citizenship, and international student mobility. She has served as an academic coordinator for various international degree programs for over 12 years, working closely with international students through teaching, support services, and mentoring. Eva and Karolina, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction, Konrad. We'll just steal the screen from you here, if we may.
Yes, we can.
For the moment. Okay. And there we go. Okay. So again, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having us. And we see, actually, I see in the list of participants that some of our students and respondents that we had the pleasure to talk to are also in the virtual room. and so we welcome everyone who is here. What we'd like to do to start off with is actually take you back to March 2020. Everyone remembers it quite well, and we'd like to start with thinking about, again, the borders that closed, the uncertainty, the real whirlwind that came about when people, but particularly those who found themselves outside of the borders, including international students, our respondents, found themselves scrambling to find planes, trains, or automobiles to get themselves back home, or to make those uncomfortable decisions of whether to stay or go and where to go, and where home really is. So we'd like to start off with the voices of some of our respondents that I think, or we think, exemplify this particular moment. So here we have, it's like I'm stuck on an unpopulated island like Robinson Crusoe. It's this matrix situation. I was kind of scared and frightened all the time. You're in a room in a city all alone, and you don't have friends. People are different, they're so different. I'm lonely here, and there is no one I can talk to. It's just a room and I don't have anywhere to go. It's very strange, but it definitely feels very isolating being back at home. So with that introduction of narratives, I'd like to go on to methodology and give the floor to Eva to briefly explain our study.
Welcome, everyone. Our study really commenced, we can say, with the lockdown. So we have found ourselves also as teachers of international students and Karolina as manager to really really seeing how the students try to find their way in this new particular situation. And we thought, like, this is the moment. This is the moment when we can really we can really catch their experiences, their narratives, their feelings and emotions. So we thought that if we don't do the study like right away, we will lose like kind of, how to say, the chance to write a story, let's say, of this mobile population. So we thought this is really something like we need to capture instantly, and this is how our exploratory study was born. So we started to invite students that we teach, but that we have a contact with first to join us online for talking about their experiences, to telling us their stories of lockdown, of decision making, of legal struggles, and of education online. So this is how it commenced. It commenced spontaneously, and we were really happy to see that, particularly at the beginning of lockdown, that the students were really eagerly joining us and wanting to really tell us the stories of their immobility, of their feeling, as we will call it, being stuck somewhere in the transnational space. So we have conducted an online study as it was the only possible one. And we have conducted 5 online focus groups with each about 3 to 5 students. And then we started also to conduct individual in-depth interviews to kind of saturate our data and try to reach different stories, different types of students. And this is very important to remember that we say international students, super mobile students, we often put students somehow into one bag, but this is a very diverse population, and we try to capture this diversity at least as much as we could, because it was at start the study without any funding. Later it was funded by Excellence Initiative of the University, but it started just as a spontaneous as a reaction to the situation. So we had 29 students, and this is a case study. So these were students that it was the easiest for us to invite and try to persuade to take part in our study. So they were enrolled in our university, in the Jagiellonian University, but really in the diverse types of programs. So there were sometimes full stationary BA or MA students, and some of them were in some kind of double or joint degree consortium programs, such as, for example, famous Erasmus Mundus joint master degrees. And there were also short-term exchange students in our sample, so particularly Erasmus students, but also some other program students that usually come for 1 or 2 semesters. And also destination-wise, the sample was diversified. We had students both from EU and from outside EU. So we had EU students from Italy, Spain, Germany, Holland, among others. And also non-EU students from China, Bangladesh, USA, Ukraine, Uzbekistan, Belarus, or Russia. So it was quite a diverse sample in this sense. What was also very important, and it also appears later important in the results, is also the length of stay. So 12 of them has just arrived to Krakow. So they also had a different experience for those who already had been before the pandemic a bit here and managed to make some connections with the local community. And also, thanks to new technology, we could make transnational, let's say, trans-border focus groups when we had students who both decided to remain in Krakow, but also those who left. So, as online, the methodology can prove not maybe as exciting, but if we would make a focus group on not online, but in the room and being really, it's let's say we could say it's the advantage of focus group to be inspired by others and to really like compare and share experiences. So we tried also to use some projection or activation techniques during our focus groups to kind of a little bit bring more entertainment during the 2 hours of talking and sitting, which seemed still. And it brought some, let's say, a more symbolic meaning to our data when people were drawing computers, some notebooks, but also putting some slogans of, like you can see, loneliness, isolation, done, bliss, redemption, I remember from others. So it was bringing also kind of this inspiration to talk about what they are living through.
Okay, so picking up from Eva and maybe highlighting here the fact that it was an exploratory study, as we were collecting data, we did chance upon a concept that we thought was quite fitting when we started interpreting the data and doing our analysis. And the concept that we stumbled upon and through our research as well is a concept of waithood, which is one that was developed by Alcinda Honvana around the first decade and second decade of the 21st century. And she was particularly focused on the experience of youth in transition to adulthood, particularly in industrializing and developing nations, as well as zones of conflict, where that process of entry into adulthood that is usually sometimes prolonged and actually more and more prolonged in our times, but nevertheless a process, becomes suspended in animation, in a sense, because of external factors, particularly difficult socioeconomic situations, or more globally, financial, something like the financial crisis in 2008, that became a very big barrier for youth to transition into adulthood. So we see, particularly in these zones, but also more generally, a generational experience, a globalized generational experience of youth, again, particularly after the 2008 financial crisis, of being confined in this waiting room before entry into adulthood. So again, this is a concept that connotates this zone of suspended animation between youth and adulthood, and we found it quite fitting to borrow this concept as a momentary experience, momentary condition that our respondents found themselves in this again in this very uncertain space and the space of inertia where they couldn't go forward, and through which we found several experiences that link very well to this concept of waithood, this waiting room. And in the next slides, we'd like to go through with you these three, in our view, most important experiences of international students during the pandemic time. So the first experience we'd like to link very strongly to the sense of space and the sense of being trapped in a very particular space, a transnational space that these students found themselves in. So I'll start off with giving a voice to our respondents with a quote, just to get a sense of what we're talking about here. So we have this feeling that I don't know when I'll get to see my family members, my mom and dad, and that's kind of scary. So yeah, and which kind of hampered my study at the same time, because if you're in a room in a city all alone and you don't have any friends, you know, people are different, they're so different. So you're still in the process of coping, and then this happens. So you can't even concentrate on the studies. I remember I missed writing 2 deadlines in one course and had to explain the situation. Like I actually can't focus. I don't feel like okay. I'm all lonely here and there's no one I can talk to. Or like it's just a room and I don't have anywhere to go. Perhaps this last sentence is quite telling of, again, this confinement that our respondents found themselves in. And what we'd, in our interpretation of this experience, we highlight this change in self-positioning and also social positioning from being mobile and sometimes super mobile, cosmopolitan, transnational, also elites, to this change in positioning to being immobile foreigners. And so with this come various consequences. So the first and strongest experience that our respondents had was this deep feeling of loneliness and isolation, firstly physical. And this is something that I think is not just an experience of our respondents. This is something that I think many of us, if not all of us, have experienced at this time, this sense of physical isolation. What is important to highlight here is that physical isolation was experienced in different places for our respondents, right? So we have this physical isolation in foreign lands, in foreign places, oftentimes just at the start of their mobility experience, and also physical isolation, sometimes having gone back home and being isolated from that world and that idea of one's future and mobility that they had constructed for themselves before the pandemic. But what is, I think, particular to our respondents and to international students, generally speaking, is this sense of isolation. I'm sorry, I'm going to stop here. Is it really loud? There are renovations going on next door, and I'm sorry. I don't know if it's really loud, but hopefully they will stop soon. Okay, so going back to the sense of also not only physical, but the sense of symbolic isolation, or in a sense decoupling from the idea that they had of being in a transnational social space, a symbolic space that is made and is constructed on the belief of the absence of borders, and also in that the value of the absence of borders, which from literally one day to the next disappeared, right? And so for our respondents, this was highlighted as, and in our interpretation of their experiences, this was highlighted as this very deep sense of isolation from this value of being in this transnational space. that then literally disappeared. And what came with that is also this need for recalibration of their, the building up of their transnational identities and their sense of belonging in these transnational spaces, which again went from being these, Erasmus bubbles or Erasmus Mundus bubbles or transnational student or international student bubbles to these spaces of being foreigners, which has a completely different connotation and different social positioning as well. What came with that was also this deprivation of agency, particularly for those who stayed behind and whose language skills were not very well developed, was the sense of being locked out of news and information coming out of the host country. So what ended up happening was there was another bubble that was made very instantaneously, and that bubble was centered around, perhaps suitably, their studies. And so, so all of a sudden, the whole experience of being an international student and the idea of being in this transnational social space disappeared, and what was left was this focus on studies and being literally stuck to a screen all day, which had tied to it a lot of different issues of motivation, lack of motivation, and the rest that perhaps we can talk about more in the discussion. So that is the summary of the first experience, and I'll go leave the floor to Eva for the second experience.
The second experience was linked to the decision-making process, and this space of uncertainty was a context for this decision-making. And we have to say that just at the beginning of the lockdown, the students that we talked to, all of them were faced with this one most important decision, if to stay in Krakow in Poland or to go home. So that was the, let's say, especially at the first focus groups, it was really like the core topic that we discussed, the reasons behind going or staying. And this context of uncertainty is here the critical one, as described in the quote that we put like at the start of this part. I was never sure when and if the university was opening again. The only thing they told us was that we don't have to worry because any decision that we will take, it won't affect our semester. So that was the information, but we were left completely free to decide to stay or to go. So I didn't really know what to do. It is important to say that at the beginning, especially of the pandemic, the flow of information was really difficult and complex, and also the development of the pandemic was unknown. And also we have to remember this in March, as let's say the knowledge about the virus was also much smaller, and there was more fear concerning the infection, how infectious and how deadly it is the virus. So this context really made the decision making very difficult, and somehow we have to say that the students really had to mature fast to take the rapid decision. Some students even told us it was like a decision that they took in 1 hour because the next day the border was closing. So it was concerned with a lot of stress and also a lot of pressures from different, from their parents, from institutions that also did not immediately put up the information about the fact if the students will keep up the scholarship, if they would be still able to be Erasmus if they are at home. Of course, this came later on, but especially at the beginning, this kind of lack of information was really overwhelming, and it was difficult to really know on what to base the decisions on. Important to note is that there was still a group of students that couldn't go home at all. So those who couldn't even, consider what they would like to do, they were stuck in Krakow because there were no repatriation flights. There was no possibility to go home, or they were afraid because of their legal status that they won't be able to be back, for example, because they had next internship arranged after Krakow and so on. So the situations were very complex and the decision making wasn't easy. So all this unpredictability about the development of epidemic, about their own lives, where they could go, if they could cross the borders, when and how. There was even a story of a student who felt almost, she said, as a refugee, that she had to cross the borders in a very complex way to be able to go home. And in this decision making, what came to the fore was this importance of feeling safe, and this feeling of security, of safety, was based on very often on very different factors in our study. Of course, the health-wise, it was important, the development of the epidemic, and we have seen that some students decided to stay in Poland because in Poland in March we still didn't have so many cases, and Poland appeared to them a safer country. They also, some of them didn't want to endanger their families so if through travel they would catch up the virus, they would infect the parents or the family at home. So this epidemiological situation was especially important also for those who had some underlying health conditions. And we have to remember that students are in different life situations. Some also had families, children in another countries. They visit regularly, and the pandemic closed the borders, and they couldn't really see their daughters or sons in their home countries. What was connected to this decision making was, of course, some kind of a deep feeling of loss. Somehow, as if they were deprived of an experience of something that they have planned for a period of their life. So there was this feeling of sadness, of kind of a grief of the experience, and that was particularly felt by those Erasmus students, I think, so short-term students in the mobility, who really planned this one life go to explore other cultures, to be in an Erasmus social group, in an Erasmus bubble, or also to gain very particular skills like English language skill, for example. And that was like they felt taken from them. But for this group of the super mobile students, maybe the experience was a little bit different, because these students have a lot of different experiences, and just one mobility maybe is not okay. They were regretting it, and they felt kind of their life plans are destroyed, but it rather brought them these reflections of being of thinking where my home is, and some students said that they kind of felt homeless. They didn't, even if they were saying going home, they were really thinking where their home is. So I share it completely. This is a quote, this feeling of being homeless, because now I am back home. This has been my home for like 20 some years, but I'm not sure whether it is my place or not now. When I'm abroad, I feel more free. So being stuck made me think all about what is actually home for me. So this reflections on mobility came also strong in this decision making, and it kind of questioned their life choices also in relation to like potential settlement. Karolina.
Okay, so following up on what Eva said, and picking out maybe one particular thing about those students who actually didn't have that choice to go home or not, I'd like to go on to the third and final experience that we want to highlight here, and is this fragility of the international student status. And one thing to underline and underscore here is the difference that we felt, and also the students felt, between being an EU citizen and a non-EU citizen, particularly in this situation. And so we have two quotes here that perhaps highlight this difference. So the first one being from a non-EU citizen, or one male respondent, who says, I want to like this feeling of fragility of my rights as an international student. As a non-EU citizen, to be kind of hidden again. I wanted to be hidden again, because I can sense it very firmly that if something happens to me here, it's much worse than if it happens to be in my country, for example, because here's not my home country. And during times like these, I can sense this very deeply. So I hope this will end sooner than even other restrictions, as in the closed borders. But then a reflection from an EU student who said, so yeah, I think in this sense, like being an international student is a dark side, because you really don't know what will happen to you if you will be, let's say, treated as a real citizen of the place, or just like some tourists. And for the, oftentimes our respondents, our EU respondents, were actually confronted with the sense of borders for the first time, and this was this first time shock for them that there can be such a thing, and it made them think in a quite a different way. Whereas for non-EU students, often the response in the focus groups was, well, welcome to my world. However, this experience of fragility of status, I think, needs to be really underscored here, because we did find a lot of students who told us of their experiences of being in real legal limbo, or at least at the beginning, at least this perception of being in legal limbo, wherein the university and the program structures that they were in, oftentimes that had in the program themselves this very intensive mobility to 2-3 places in Europe. All of a sudden, these agreements, international agreements that they were based on between universities, didn't trump and were not able to supersede national decisions that were made from one day to the next. And so even though some of our students were grant holders from the European Commission and were meant to travel here and there and everywhere, all of a sudden couldn't even get their visas extended. What is important to underscore here is also the respondents felt that the universities and oftentimes the program structures did give them that sense of support, but especially at the beginning, there was a lack of information coming from the top down. And so this created this real sense of uncertainty and precariousness of their legal status. Beyond that, what was a common experience for all international students, whether EU or non-EU, was this fear or this potential of being treated differently, or as being treated not as these transnational cosmopolitan movers, but actually as foreigners. And this was particularly true also some of our respondents, particularly from Asia, who again had that fear that they would perhaps be stigmatized doubly for having a connection to the spread of the pandemic. So this was something that was strongly felt. The other experience that both ran across EU and non-EU respondents was this feeling of, for some, of being abandoned by their countries. And so there was a big difference between those students who had support from their countries to have flights back home or to have consular services, and those who had no support whatsoever. So as a final note to this third experience, it really highlighted the uncertain and precarious nature that could be associated with international student mobility. That is often hidden and not something that you would think about in commencing your studies. And so I give it back to you, Eva, to summarize our conclusions here so that we can give the floor to others.
Yes, just to kind of conclude and to put into light the most important threads that we decided to discuss today. First one was related to fragility, and Karolina just talked about this fragility in relation to the legal anchoring and this institutional anchoring of international students. But also this fragility somehow was felt also in relation to their life projects, and these life projects are especially particularly for this supermobile group based on a project of mobility. So they often see that the transitions to adulthood being filled up with mobile kind of search, or with mobile kind of professional advancements. So the professional advancement, the educational advancement is seen as happening on the move, is seen as happening somewhere in the transnational space. And they felt in this particular moment that somehow this project that they have built about their future is put into the question. This fragility was also felt in the stories of these short-term students who just lost their experience, and somehow we can say that that this pandemic experience brought this we call it with Karolina the third absence, and we here expand on the concept of Alden Malek Savat's concept of double absence in migration. So the migrants somehow absent from two spaces. So they are absent from their home countries together with the country where they are in. So somehow these students were also, on one hand, absent from their home countries, but also absent from the hosting countries, and even more absent because they were closed and they were kind of away from the public space, and because of the lockdown. But somehow they were also locked and absent in this transnational space that they build being abroad, and this fragility was particularly strong for those students who were deprived of those transnational bonds, transnational social networks. This is why we have seen that those students who arrived just before the pandemic and they didn't create this network in Poland, they were mostly leaving because they didn't feel secure, safe here, and this kind of being able to rely on some even flatmate was particularly important in the time of closure. And so it was a kind of a process when the people were leaving. So this fragility was related very much also to this transnational space, which disappeared somehow, or was kind of made virtual, almost like moved online during the pandemic. And then the second thread we want to highlight, the conclusion, is this concept of waithood. So this decision making about their life project, as I said, was put on hold. It was an external condition, so it was something that just halted, like sometimes there even ideas about the summer trips, and they were deprived of even internships. They felt a loss. They have to wait for something new to be constructed when this will finish, let's say, and so it was diminishing sometimes their agency, and they felt stressed and confined, and they sometimes even were questioning their life choices, which were strongly tied to mobility. So this waithood, and it would be interesting to maybe talk to them now, because the situation has changed within this few months, and it's not so maybe intense as it was when we were talking with them, but is this waithood still on, or are decisions now even maybe more possible? And the third point is about this imagined future. Is we asked them about if this experience of lockdown has changed their kind of thinking about their futures and about mobility in their futures, and most of them, let's say, didn't even want to imagine the future without mobility. They said it was linked to their life project, very strongly to their identity, and also sometimes even to their safety, that they didn't feel safe for particular reasons in their home countries. So they felt that they have to be mobile to be somehow free individuals, but so mobility was there still in their life plans, and it was making the big. It still had to have had a big role, and they wanted to keep this big role of mobility, but they started to question the rootlessness that supermobility brings, and some of them was thinking about trying to construct some kind of a safe space where they can be rooted, and that could be in such situations be kind of a refuge that would provide them with let's say safety, but also with the feeling of belonging and where maybe the important people are with them. So I would like to thank you for your attention, and also at the end I would like to thank first of all the participants of our study who shared their stories with us, and we were able to present just like a part of what we have heard, and thank you for that. And we would like to thank the funding association also, Eva Modebadze, our research assistant, who supported us in organizing the data.
Thank you very much, Eva and Karolina, for sharing this research. Very interesting data. I will discuss it during Q&A. Big thanks, a special thanks, I think, to Karolina for being able to speak while the builders are knocking down the space around her. So this is amazing. It's only with Zoom seminars you can experience that. So we are a special, really appreciations for Karolina for managing. So thanks a lot. And now, without further ado, I'd like to give the chance to Professor Janusz Mucha, who leads Committee of Migration Research of the Polish Academy of Science, and Professor Janusz Mucha was also one of the co-creators of the Multiculturalism and Migration Observatory, and he's a member of the editorial boards of the Polish Sociological Review and other journals, being particularly interested in conflict and social change theories, theory and history of sociology, social anthropology, minority and ethnic relations, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. And I had a pleasure to collaborate with Professor Janusz Mucha on research on international students in Krakow last year, and hopefully, apart from sharing his views and comments on the research carried out by Eva and Karolina, he will also share some of the findings of our research from last year. Janusz, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me, guys?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation to the seminar. And first of all, I would like to congratulate Eva and Karolina, or Karolina and Eva, I don't remember, to congratulate this. First, the idea of this project, the conceptual framework, and also very well done design and execution of the empirical research, also typologies and the way you use the concepts, the concepts in the interpretation of data. So I have no problem with that, and I really do hope that this study will be published as soon as possible, because it will add a lot to our knowledge about some social aspects of the pandemic, and also the social aspect of mobility and immobility. And I like also this idea of putting together mobility and immobility and mobility dreams and the mobility put on hold and whitehood and everything. I like that very much. However, I have some reservations, and the first reservation is to the title. I think that the title is unfortunate because it is universalizing the experiences of some categories of students of one university in a particular country. And what is important for me here is that Poland, let's start with Poland. Poland is at the very end of the list of countries which invite and accept foreign students. So Polish experience is, in my opinion, from this I would say, numerical point of view, completely irrelevant for the situation, for the analysis of the situation of mobility and immobility of students. The other thing is that what is the social structure of the population of foreign students in Poland? And this social structure is not reflected in this interpretative analysis of Karolina and Eva. And I am not saying that the statistical representation is important here, but I would be interested in what you think about the, I would call it, qualitative representation of experiences of stress situation and stress period. So let me put that very important and interesting study into a little bit different, perhaps bigger, but for sure different perspective. In Poland in 2019, 60% of all foreign students came from two countries, and these two countries are Ukraine and Belarusia. These two countries of our neighbors, countries of the post-Soviet Federation, and this all Polish situation reflects also in Krakow. If we look at Krakow, we would see that in 15 universities with particular involvement in the student exchange, Ukrainians are the largest group, and on the second place are again Belarusians, and 3/4 of the population of foreign students, 3/4 are Ukrainians or Belarusians. This is one thing. The other thing is that Jagiellonian University is the most important university if you look from various points of view, among them from the point of view of foreign students, exchange students. This university has about 3,000 of foreign students in different programs. But if you look at the percentage of foreign students among the population of students at large, this is not the largest percentage in Krakow. In Krakow, Friedrich Academy or Krakow Academy has 26% of foreigners. 26% of their students are foreigners. And now let's return for a moment to Eva and Karolina's study. As we remember, they did the research, they conducted the research between March and June. So it has some extremely positive and some putting in doubt aspects. What is really great is, in my opinion, that they started this research immediately when the pandemic came to Poland and when the lockdown started. But then what I understand totally is that they continued until June, but the way this research was designed, and I'm not criticizing, I'm analyzing, means that we are talking about a period and of a dynamic of this situation of pandemic, of the sensitivity to the pandemic among the population of Poland, of Krakow, and among foreign students. So in my opinion, the students interviewed in March are completely different than the students interviewed in June. We have 29 students in this sample of varying programs, 18 students from European Union and 11 students from non-European Union. And again, let me remind you, in Jagiellonia, in Krakow universities, 3/4 of the students are from two countries, it's Ukraine and Belarus. Next thing, and again, I'm analyzing and not criticizing, is that among these students, these 29 students, there are some students who just came, and obviously their situation and experience and pandemic experience is completely different than of those who stayed longer. Okay, and again, for a bigger picture, in my opinion, it would be very interesting to know what was the competence for the experience of stress situation and experience of stress period, because this stress is a dynamic situation. What is very important is competence in Polish. That is mentioned in this study that I read. But I think that this factor is very important, competence in Polish. And again, let me return to the various programs. There is a difference between the students who came as Erasmus participants on the one hand and studying most of the subjects in English, and students who came to study in a regular BA or MA programs and studying in Polish. And this competence in Polish translates also on the dynamics of relations with Poles. Poles meaning Polish students and also others, just with the natives, and their competence in integrating with the native population. So the language in which they studied, the competence in Polish, in my opinion, is very important. The contacts with the natives, as I mentioned also. The aspect that I miss in this study is also the dynamics of the university administration reactions to this crisis, because it changed. That is mentioned, but I would like to kind of oppose or putting the subjective experiences into the background of the dynamics of the reactions of the university. What is also interesting for me is the cultural life of foreign students during the pandemic. I wonder if they had any cultural life, if they participate in any events online or offline. After a while, some clubs were open, coffee shops were open. Online, there is very important aspect of this situation of foreign students and foreigners in Krakow is the Facebook groups. I wonder if they belong to any self-help or other Facebook groups, if they were contacting with others from their own national group or from other groups. To sum it up, I really believe that this is a very important, from the academic point of view, very important study, that it is also very important from the social point of view. I mean, if published, and I hope it will be published, it will enlarge the knowledge on the situation, not only among the academics, but also among others from the from the general audience. But in my opinion, it would be good if it was put into a broader perspective. Okay, thank you, Konrad.
Thank you very much, Janusz. Thanks a lot. We believe that while designing this seminar, we believe that this experience of immobility of the supermobile is not only is not limited to Poland, obviously, it's limited to the whole world, and we wanted to have the international voice in this, and I'm super happy that David Cairns, I hope, David, I'm pronouncing your surname properly, has greatly agreed to join our seminar and to comment, but also to present his and his team research on the situation of international students during the pandemic in Portugal. David is a renowned researcher of student migrations. He's a researcher at the based at the Center for Research and Studies in Sociology, University Institute of Lisbon, Portugal. Previously, he has worked and studied at Queen's University Belfast, National University of Ireland, Galway, and University of Lisbon, and been a visiting scholar at universities in Ireland, Armenia, Estonia, China, and Singapore. His research interest includes youth mobility, education, and political participation, and he's a member of the European Commission Council of Europe Youth Partnership Pool of European Researchers. Thank you very much once again, David, for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yes, I will just talk a little bit about my interpretations of Eva's and Karolina's work, and then I will talk about some work that I've been involved here with my colleagues in Portugal. But yeah, just to introduce myself again, I've been a researcher of various forms of youth mobility for a very long time. I think, like Eva, I started in 2005. I had to look that up. So we've roughly been doing it for about the same amount of time. And it's been very interesting to be a researcher of mobility in this era, because we have moved from a position where to be a mobile student was a rare or experience or something confined to people from relatively elite backgrounds. And we moved to a point where that has become much more accessible. Shouldn't have observed, we've gone from a point where practices like student mobility have now become very popular, relatively accessible and democratized, which means that we've gone from a position where this was a pursuit amongst people from relatively well-off backgrounds to where we have people from a variety of different variety of different socioeconomic backgrounds engaging in student mobility. So it's not just rich people. We have people from different with kind of different levels of social and economic capital involved in student mobility. And this is quite important in regard to what we might refer to as pre-existing vulnerabilities, because not everyone is going to be equally equipped to cope with the shock of the pandemic. So in terms of a starting place, it was very interesting to read Eva's and Karolina's presentation. I think there are a lot of commonalities with the work that we've been doing here in Portugal around about the same time. I mean, we did our research during the lockdown period, which was between March and May. So our work is roughly contemporaneous. We did almost the same number of cases. We had 27 students, although I think we had a more broad-based sample. I mean, we didn't just include people from our own university. We had people from all over Portugal. And also we had a mix of European students doing programs like Erasmus, but also well, Portugal is a very popular destination for students from Brazil and the Portuguese-speaking African countries. So we have a very good representation from those people as well. But in terms of my reflection on the previous presentation, I think there are obviously some concerns right now about the viability of programs like Erasmus, and as well practices like migrating for the course of a degree. So we basically have a lot of doubt as to whether or not this can continue, or certainly whether it can continue at the same level of popularity. Some of these issues are just unfortunate, but it may be that there were already pre-existing issues. So, for example, the lack of support on offer to student migrants. So these things have just become more apparent. They were already there, but we can just see them a lot more clearly with the pandemic situation. I think another interesting aspect of my work on student mobility, and I know Eva's as well, is we've been looking at the what we might term the identity consequences arising from mobility within Europe, especially for Europeans. And it was interesting that this remark emerged about the pandemic making some international students feel like foreigners. In fact, I would go even further. I mean, I think there are people who now feel as if they've been kind of trafficked across borders for the benefit of their universities. And these universities now basically pretend they don't exist. So it's very strange that their main concern is about the loss of revenue rather than the well-being of their international students. And I don't just say that as a kind of concern with the health and well-being of the students. I mean, I actually think that's a bad strategy. I mean, it's bad publicity for your mobility programs if you don't look after your students now, because this, maybe the situation will improve, but it could happen again. So there is going to be long-term doubts about the viability of student mobility in all its forms, and people will certainly be asking questions about health and safety issues. And at a more kind of imaginative level, so the presentation mentioned the importance of the kind of idea of the dream of mobility, which so immobility has now come as something of a shock to Europeans. But it may be that the idea of free movement was always a bit of a myth, and certainly intra-European circulation was never free from bureaucracy. I mean, that is not true. I mean, anyone who has had to come into contact with health systems, welfare services, even the education system, taxation, as well as immigration policies can tell you this. So the idea that the students were able to kind of float around Europe unencumbered, I mean, that really wasn't true to begin with. But now, of course, we know for certain that was a lie. I think in terms of other consequences arising from this sudden onset of immobility, we really have to question the manner in which Europeans migrate, and not only students. So during the lockdown, one of the things I did was I edited a book, which is the handbook, the Palgrave handbook on youth mobility. So as part of that, I had to write some theoretical sections, which basically looked at the various chapters of that book, which looked at not only student mobility, but also mobility for work amongst trainees. And what I concluded was that Europeans, while their circulation may be described in terms of mobility, when you actually look at their mobility over a period of time, it does kind of add up to a form of migration, just not the kind of migration we associate with that particular term. But there is a certain vulnerability relating to the pandemic, because this is mobility divided into little episodes. So obviously travel is more difficult these days, so it's more difficult to kind of string together a whole series of mobility episodes. And even within a program like Erasmus, you can have people, they'll do an undergraduate exchange, they might do a work placement, and they might do Erasmus Mundus. So it's obviously, it's much more complicated if you're moving in different directions or circulating, rather than just doing a migration in the classical sense of going somewhere and staying there for a prolonged period. So I think we have to kind of think about, you know, how we practice migration as Europeans as well, you know, starting with the student period. So those were just some of my reflections, some of my extrapolations from the previous presentations. And about our own work, I should say up front that I didn't do any of the interviews. It was 3 of my colleagues who are here somewhere, I think. So I'd like to say hello to Taj, Daniel, and Leonardo. And certainly any questions about the material, I'm sure they can address that. But just to explain what we actually achieved. We were specifically looking at students during the lockdown period in Portugal, focusing on the emotional and the economic impacts. What we basically found was that another side of student mobility has emerged, you know, beneath this glossy surface of happy Europeans, you know, coming to Portugal to do surfing, you know, and have a lovely time. So we really want to re-emphasize or emphasize the importance of the vulnerability of a lot of these young people. And one very interesting finding, just to pull out some results that, you know, maybe aren't that self-evident. I mean, we find that a lot of these international students, especially those from Brazil and Africa, they were very much dependent on temporary, you know, precarious jobs in the hospitality sector, in tourism, and obviously they lost their jobs when the lockdown started, because you know, they were on, you know, precarious contracts or no contracts at all. So we have a kind of interesting finding in the sense of the financial situations of a lot of these international students has become very difficult, because they've lost a crucial element of their income, even those who received scholarships. And that is obviously in addition to the more, you know, obvious stress of isolation. And also there's the fear of the consequences for people who they fear if they went home, they might lose out on their student mobility experience. So that's quite interesting. And regarding to what is happening, what has happened with internationalized learning, obviously everything has been moved online. So that is not being without its difficulties. Obviously, not everyone has the right facilities or the right access to technology to be able to continue their studies. But I think what we concluded was that international learning has now become a national experience, or even a local experience, which is obviously not necessarily what people expected. A much greater reliance upon the people in your household, as opposed to the more kind of traditional Erasmus bubble of interculturality. And also things like even the value of open space within local communities, you know, especially parks, has been recognized. And I think this idea of you know, focusing on the local, or even on the immediate surroundings of your household, it's a big contrast to the more traditional associations student mobility has with individualized success and then a kind of cosmopolitan lifestyle. So this couldn't be any further from that. But another interesting point, and I'll make this my last point, was that, you know, regardless of what has happened, the this we actually called the title of our study the Immobility Pandemic. But regardless of that, most of the people we interviewed, they still imagine a future that involves, you know, a significant degree of international mobility. So people basically expected at the time the interviews were conducted. Maybe people think differently now, a few months later, but they kind of expected things to return to normal. Even talking about the start of this academic year as a time when things would have returned to normal, which obviously has not been the case. So there was a relative lack of concern with long-term consequences. Not a great deal of consideration of what this event would have on their eventual careers or the future job prospects. I mean, they're certainly thinking about how to complete their studies or how to complete their mobility exercise, their mobility placement, but thinking about, you know, whether or not they're going to be able to secure a job in the future, nobody seems to, or at least that has not really become evident among the interviewees. So I think my 15 minutes are up. So.
Thank you very much, David, for your thoughts on Karolina's and Eva's research, and super interesting also thoughts on the global context and the Portuguese context. This is, I think, super interesting, and I have many questions, and I believe, and we have already a long list of questions. But before I post these questions, I would like to give now a chance to Eva and Karolina to very briefly respond to the comments made by Janusz and David, and then open up for a proper Q&A. So if you could do it briefly, I'll be very grateful. Thanks. So go ahead, girls.
Okay.
Should I start?
Sure, go ahead, Eva.
Okay, so I start and then you take some. I try to take the notes, so I'll just go by the list and then try to address the points raised. So thank you so much for the comments. I think a lot of them were also, let's say, somewhere in our heads, and we are aware of the limitations of our study, and we try to saturate the data as much as possible. And so maybe just starting with the Janusz comments on the social structure of students. It's true that actually the Ukrainian and Belarusian students are like the largest population. In Jagiellon University, actually Ukrainian students are the largest population, and there are something like 1,500 students out of 5,000 international students as of the current statistics. So they do constitute the largest group. We have had a special, let's say, phase of recruitment when we tried to reach the Eastern countries students, and we had participants from Ukraine and from Belarus as well. We had noticed something interesting. Actually, the students from Ukraine or from other countries like Belarus, but also we tried to reach students who are also from Latvia, Lithuania. They also study on stationary studies in Polish. That actually they have not perceived themselves as international students. So it was not an obvious way to reach this group of respondents. They tried to really going through the Polish tracks. I believe we at least find this way to explain the difficulty to reach this group of students, and they haven't perceived themselves as belonging to international students. They very often just have a very good, almost perfect knowledge of Polish language. So they study with the regular students, and somehow disassociate with maybe Erasmus student network or some association, for example, for international students. So just to say, yes, the experiences of this group were different, and the language was the important factor. It wasn't the only important factor. Although there were also some similarities, like impossibility to travel and being stuck, and impossibility, for example, go back to the countries. So some things were as well shared. The decision making and the feeling of uncertainty was also present. somehow within this group. But it's true that maybe it would be important to kind of saturate more data about this group and maybe make some kind of sub-analysis. It is also a very important variable, this dynamic situation of pandemic, and we put it in our article, like it was important when the interview was conducted. So the interviews at the beginning were really about like this decision making, and then the interviews which were a little bit later, they were different because people could already go a little bit out. But even I remember I have conducted one interview in July, and it was individual interview, and this person, and the quote about Robinson Crusoe being stuck as an unpopulated island, it comes from July. So this person still couldn't go home. This person still felt like being locked. So it's a variable that is very important. Also the fact if they just arrived to Poland or they have been already here, and if students been here, for example, on the second year of the master degree, so they had already been for 1.5 years in Krakow, they had some social networks developed, and these could create some level of support. So that was another important variable. The socio-economic background, yes, that's another. This is another variable that comes into the fore. We didn't gather. Focus groups is not maybe a right forum to ask about this socio-economic background because it bears a lot of judgment. So we didn't get direct information about the socio-economic background, but there are some cues we can take if they are in the self-paid programs or they have scholarships that can give you some information. Definitely, some students mentioned the financial issues as critical. So we can say that economic situation and the economic vulnerability was also a very important stress factor. Some students lost the jobs in the pandemic or had issues, delays with the scholarship. So for some time the money was not coming, even if it was ultimately arriving. But this was the moment of financial stress and here, yes, the situations were different. Some students could rely on support of others, and some couldn't. Karolina, you want to take it now, or should I proceed?
Maybe I'll just mention a few things, maybe going and linking what you said, David, to your comments, Janusz. David, you mentioned the precariousness, particularly of Brazilian and North African students in Portugal, and how many of them had lost their part-time jobs during the pandemic. And I think this we can also relate to students who have made their homes in Krakow, so longer term students, and perhaps this will go more to the representative sample of international students in Poland, so namely more Ukrainian and Belarusian students who have made their home here and who are here for a longer period. And the students coming from those places whom we interviewed also signaled those kind of difficulties in this situation, right? So perhaps there's a link to be made, and not only, but particularly these students. That's one note, and one other thing, and I think I've mentioned a lot of the comments, responses to the comments, particularly from Janusz. And one other thing that I'd like to add, David, you talked about this myth of European mobility, and that we always knew that it wasn't as easy as it seems. And I would highlight that fact again and say that even though that there are European directives in place that in theory make it easier and very easy even for third country nationals to particularly students and researchers through the Student and Researcher Directive, aptly named, from 2016, it's meant to make it easier to travel around Europe, and it's meant particularly for these for programs, super mobility programs, that constitute movement to 1, 2, 3 places within a 2-year period, for example. These directives exist even in national law, but no one knows about them. You know, and so if the border guards don't know about them, if the people working at the Foreigner Office don't know about them, then they don't exist, right? Even though they exist on paper. And this was this real disconnect between the theory and the practice of mobility, European mobility. So I definitely echo your thoughts here. And I think there's lots to say, but I think there are many questions also. I see some questions from the audience. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. One of the questions which is asked by a person from the audience, we have a whole list. So I'll first go with and now open for Q&A. So if anybody wants to pick up on some point, please do so, either in the chat box or let us know if you want to ask a question live. I'll give a chance to ask question to Trinch in a minute. But before, a few questions which were asked in the chat box by participants who wanted me to pose this question. So one is the first was from Hannah, and she asked, did you find there to be a point where individuals' mental health positively adapted to the uncertainty of the situation? And a question from Professor Slany. She said, speaking of loneliness, that it was hard because people are different. What did that mean? So who are we and what are these features? The third question was from Elisa. Did you have any information on the participants' socioeconomic background? Did this have any impact on their feelings and opportunities? So basically, it's a little bit to what extent the question, their socioeconomic situation impacted also their emotions. And probably here, Davy could also say a little bit more, because I feel that you have said too little about your research in Portugal, and you said that emotional economic elements were the most important. And I think this is one of the super important points also mentioned by Janusz, which was visible in our research in Krakow, that a very substantial percentage, especially of the, let's say, students from the former USSR, these students are super often working, and they, as a result of pandemic, they lost their jobs, and the precariousness of the situation, the uncertainty was hugely related to this financial uncertainty. And I wonder whether you can see that in your research, and I believe this is more or less what also Elisa Alves had in mind. And Karol Kaczorowski had a question: did the participants mention any impact on their employment? Here again, employment comes into part-time, or it's just a perception of future employment. So if you could try to answer some of these questions, and then I would give the floor to Trinch to ask his question. All right.
I don't know if maybe I can.
Do you want me to? I can also put this question in the chat box, because they were asked in the past, and maybe you've kind of lost track of them. So what I'll do as well,
I can see them.
You can see them. Okay, I'll put them into chat box so you can see one by one. But maybe it would be easier. Yeah.
I don't know. I can take the questions about the mental health.
Yeah, so maybe you just start, Karolina, and then I do the leftover questions.
Okay, and David, then you can go as well. I think one thing that needs to be stressed, and that we didn't actually mention in our presentation, and it's something that comes out in the recommendations that we're also making to university authorities in terms of how to deal with the next or the ongoing situation. There's a need to stress about the real presence of mental health issues that came out of this situation, that also kind of lifted the lid on mental health issues that are present anyway in the student population, and particularly in the international student population. So we found, and the respondents that we talked to were actually quite open to say that that they were under a huge amount of anxiety and stress, and bouts of depression that had a massive impact on their mental health, but also their educational trajectory, right? And so one of the quotes that we had in the presentation just briefly touched upon this, about this, first and foremost, this inability to concentrate, the difficulty to concentrate, the difficulty in maintaining levels of motivation. And this is linked also to, online teaching and learning, which is a whole other kettle of fish that, David, that you touched upon. And so this is really important to say. And one of the expert interviews that we did have was with the people who run the Student Support Center at the Jagiellonian University, so the Student Mental Health Support Center, which is just a godsend. Actually, they've only been around for 2 years. This is the second year that the center exists. It's been really helpful, but it's never enough, right? So just to stress that these issues were very present in the narratives that the students put forth, and in the question that was asked, was there a point where individuals' mental health positively adapted to the uncertainty of the situation? That's an interesting one. So I think it depended on the situation, the individual situations that the students were in. I think the first part of the pandemic was a shock to everyone, and that's something that I think we can all identify with. And those who had the agency, those who had the social and economic capital to be able to deal with it, then we saw that those that they had the ability to also change their mental or psychological state, right? Those who were not in that position to deal with it, who maintained in that condition of waithood for longer, to use the term, often found it more difficult as time went on, right? So this prolongation of the waithood had a very adverse effect on their mental health. So that was dependent on different situations. So I'll leave it at that.
Maybe it's important also to mention what were the ways, because the students were telling us how they tried to adapt, how they tried to cope with the situation, with the stress and anxiety or panic attacks. So many of them mentioned actually learning and education as a structure that was giving their day certain points, and that they could really. So I think one strategy was really to concentrating on education and on learning, and that was something that filled in their day and provided it with the given points and the task to complete. And that also links to the comment of Professor Mucha about culture, because I remember quite many comments about students who actually started to value culture more. And they told us that they had time to listen to operas, to theaters. They discovered radio, many of them, books, and I remember someone said that I wouldn't survive without the books, and I really appreciated the literature and the culture that we have. So that I think that was an interesting revelation. Sport was also mentioned, I think, as a way to keep up with the routine. Meditations and yoga, people were also bringing these tools. I remember also one story about really needing the support of the close people, and some people really use, of course, social media to stay connected with the important ones, even for hours of connections, even for the whole days in the virtual transnational spaces of being together. So really, there were many ways. Diaries, I think many people also came back to material objects like writing diaries or really writing down on paper what they have to do every hour. So I think there were quite many strategies, and somehow routine was also felt to be giving them peace in this kind of uncertain and unpredictable space. And Professor Slany asked about loneliness because people are different. I think, as I understand this question, who said who are the people? I think she meant, yes, Polish people and Polish society, because this person was, I think, locked alone. This was an non-EU student locked alone in an apartment. I think having quite recently arrived, so really not being able yet to integrate into or adapt to the local society, nor having a transnational space either, so that was this person was deprived of all this, both having a local context and transnational context, because both were somehow unavailable. And coming back to this financial, yes, this social economic background, how did it impact their feelings and opportunities? I think it had a tremendous impact. So people who couldn't manage financially, that was their main worry. So we, in fact, our Eva, who works with us, she had an interesting idea to really to kind of put the needs of students in a pyramid. So if the financial security was not there, then all the others were just behind them. But when all the financial security, social network was there, then people were coming, for example, to the reflections about ecological impact, which brings us back to maybe Englehart, post-materialistic values theory as well. You need to have basic needs sustained to be able to think maybe on our identity projects. And also in case of perception of the future employment, what Carol was asking about, that was very much touched upon, especially in this group of supermobile students, because these were the master's students who were often at the edge of transitioning from education to the labor market. So it's also important to see those students that they were in different points on the transition to adulthood. Some were just at the beginning of their studies, Erasmus, wanted to experience new culture, and they lost this opportunity of youthfulness maybe. But they were not yet at the edge of the labor market. And then there were those who are really now in this second semester completing their master thesis and trying to find a job afterwards, because maybe they already had spent so much money on their master degree and they wanted to kind of finally earn some money. So it was a different moment in their life trajectories. So there was a lot of stress, especially particularly in this group of people who were at the edge of the labor market, trying to find jobs, having sometimes interviews for foreign jobs, but they were not sure if they will be able to get them, if they will be able to travel to those jobs, if their internships will come to the realization. So there was a lot of uncertainty at that moment in this relation. But there was also this, I tried to highlight in the presentation, that some of them this pandemic also dismantled a bit their life plans, so they really try to see if this is feasible actually to have international kind of career anymore, or maybe they should look for something stable. So there were doubts as well expressed by especially those students in their master degrees. Mm-hmm.
Can I talk now?
Yes, I think I'm trying to see if I don't want to leave anyone with being forgotten, but I think we have tried to, with Karolina, approach almost every person who asks questions, so no one is like without answers.
Nobody is left. That's fine.
Nobody is left behind. Thank you,
David.
Yeah, I was just going to say it really helps to have a nice house. But yeah, we kind of know from previous research. In fact, Daniel, my colleague, who's in the room virtually, he has done a lot more research on this than I have. So he is really the expert in the field of student housing. But we already had a student housing crisis here in the city of Lisbon. So the situation was bad to begin with. And I said, so some people were lucky. When the lockdown came, they had nice houses, and they were able to tell us about, having barbecues out on the veranda, or have a roof garden or something, or they just live next door to a park. I live next door to 3 parks, super lucky. But yeah, so we have, on the one hand, you have people who seem to cope reasonably well because they had this space, and also somewhere where they could continue their work as well without any interruptions. But of course there is the other extreme. For example, people who were living in university dormitories, which was some very harrowing accounts of the rigorous rules to which they were subjected. I mean, first of all, a lot of the Portuguese students who were in these halls would have left. So it would have been just they were kind of depopulated in a sense. So there was an isolation from that. But also, yeah, they had various rules that people left behind to observe. For example, in how they use the kitchen. So, and for making, trips to buy groceries. So they had to endure this very regulated life during the period of the state of emergency. So that was, several months of a very, intense stress. So a big contrast in terms of the impact of housing conditions on coping with the lockdown. But in regard to the economic issue, well, I think really, with the exception of a few super rich people, international students generally have at least 3 sources of income. First of all, they might have a scholarship or a grant, which is usually pretty small. Secondly, they will have income from their families, in most cases, which again may be pretty small, may also fluctuate, because remember, the parents back home, they may have lost their jobs, their financial situations may have been affected, and also a more long-standing issue relates to currency fluctuations. So obviously in Brazil, not quite a lot of instability there already. Also, we've had a recent financial crisis in Angola. So all these issues are already creating vulnerabilities. And of course, the third income stream I've already mentioned is from jobs. So, I mean, yeah, a lot of material on that. People who worked in restaurants, in tourism, lost their jobs. But if you're looking for a new job, it could be in a hospital. A bit difficult right now, or even in a supermarket doing deliveries. So there's actually been a change in the kind of the student job market as well. So that's obviously people have to work. I mean, regardless of the situation. So that is very a major source of stress. So was there anything else I had to answer?
I think this you've picked up the remaining questions. And there's a question that I'm sorry for mispronunciation, but the three wanted to ask. live. So if you could, Trish, probably, this is the proper pronunciation. If you could unmute yourself and start your video. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello, everybody. After listening to your representation, I have one question: that how did the respondents cope with deal with their depression, anxiety, and emotional fragility during the pandemic, especially if they are non-Euro citizens, they are Asian, and they couldn't go back to their hometown in that period? And how long does the depression last? Just a short period of time or a long-term depression? Thank you.
Thank you very much for asking this question live as well. I understand that you are a student, international student.
Yes, I am international student of Euroculture program.
And you based where?
Yes.
Where are you based?
You mean my home? I'm sorry.
From which country you are?
I'm from Vietnam.
Okay.
Yes. As I think I am Asian, and when I'm in Krakow, I think I'm really different from other students from Brazil, America, and also from other countries that also white color.
Yeah.
So I think if I am Asian and I was in Krakow like 6 months ago, how would I been? And that's why I want to ask that question. Thank you.
I'm super grateful that you asked this question, and you picked up on a super important point, and I would like to a little bit elaborate on that and pose this to David, Eva, and Karolina, namely the question of race and racialization during the pandemic. You've hardly tackled this issue, and especially this was a really big thing at the very early stages of the pandemic, when Trump was speaking live about the Chinese virus, when some Vietnamese people were being chased in Poland, and when people generally perceived the pandemic as something that was brought by Asians, and far Asians in particular. So persons, visibly looking minorities, were particularly kind of scapegoated. And I wonder, I would like you to pick up on this and to elaborate a little bit. And I think it is and again, once again, a big thanks to Trinch for posing this question.
David, perhaps I'll leave it to you to start because...
Yeah.
The builders are back, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, I can speak a little bit. I don't think we had any Asian students in our sample, but I do know that there are pre-existing issues regarding racism and racialization based around the kind of traditional colonial relationships. So in other words, I've got construction noise going on as well now. It's terrible, but they're painting inside, so sorry about that. But I was just going to say that for the African students, for example, I mean, they would still face a certain level of racism and discrimination that isn't related to the pandemic, but that's a pre-existing issue. But where it might relate to the pandemic is in regard to their level of social integration into local communities. So it may be that whether they are actual student migrants who have moved specifically for the purpose of a course, or if they were already in the country and just went to a Portuguese university, it may be that they don't have the same locally based resources that domestic students or other European students can draw upon. So in that sense, because they may have a weaker or a more fragile integration within local communities, they may be losing out on a source of support that other people can use to help cope. So in that sense, there's a kind of an indirect impact from racism and various forms of disadvantage, but not specifically because of the pandemic. It's just something that may become more apparent.
Okay, if I can interject, if you can hear me, I'm lucky I have a balcony, but I don't know if the noise is following me here. I think just in response to your question, first of all, I think it's very individualized, obviously a very individualized set of reactions that students had. One of the factors that it was dependent on also were cultural factors and how culturally accepted it is to talk about mental health issues. Yeah, and so we had a very wide diversity of student respondents, and some students were much more comfortable not only because of their personal comfort zone, but also because culturally talking about mental health issues is more accepted. So I'd point to that factor to as something that influenced. We had a few Asian students as well as in our group of respondents, and also in our programs. And I think another factor that influences it is the strength of the support system within actual programs of study, right? And so if students had that support network with other students, particularly international students, I'm talking about here, then we saw that it was a sense of support that was very much needed. Yeah, it also depended on the support structures of the university, and different programs had different support structures. One thing I noted before is that the Jagiellonian University now does have a center to support students who, so in a form of counseling for students, which became really important again to students, whether they used it or not. But the thought that something is there that is free, that they can access, was already noted as something that is positive. Many, or if most of them, didn't use these services because of various other reasons, but the potential was there. And again, as I noted, it's something that also needs to be developed in the Polish culture and in the Polish institutions, institutional framework to talk more and make mental health issues more accessible. And I'll leave it at that because I think the renovations are coming closer and closer.
Thanks. Thank you. Eva, would you like to say something? If not, I would like to give the chance to Janusz as well to comment.
Just shortly, because
Yes.
I wanted, in fact, to link to the comment that Janusz made about some kind of contact between the students, and they were these. We were asking about these initiatives because somehow we have seen, for example, in Polish society, a lot of initiatives at the local level, and this is maybe something that also David was mentioning, and somehow the students being more relating to the transnational space are somehow cut from. So they were kind of cut from these grassroots initiatives, self-help groups, self-support groups from the local community in Poland. But there were some initiatives for students who were meeting up and trying to constitute also, let's say, safety networks for themselves. But it wasn't, I would say, superbly active. Somehow I think I felt that they still rely more on structures of the university to provide that. And in fact, they were sometimes even shocked how open and going forward the teachers and some staff was. In some cases, in other cases, they weren't, they didn't meet it. So that would mean that this is not something that is institutionalized yet, but it was rather depending on actual initiative of a teacher, of a program manager. if like for like this direct empathetic support to students. So maybe that should be something that would need more like a actual structure in case of emergencies to provide some kind of intermediate support, not directly the psychological intervention, but some kind of a support group. This is what also students felt, that SOVA is more like for just like very, if you're like almost like wanting to commit suicide, that this is when you should go to SOVA, not for like a mediocre, for like just having some counseling if you just need some maybe advice or some guidance.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Janusz, the floor is yours. You could unmute yourself. You are muted. You have to unmute yourself. Yeah. We can't hear you, Janusz. You have to unmute yourself. In the left down corner.
Now?
Yeah, teraz. Yeah, now it's fine.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to add one thing only and be very brief. This is about a conceptual framework. What struck me actually both during reading the text and then during the presentation of the authors and later during one of the comments by Eva, I think, is the unobviousness of the category of foreigner. It seems that it's really that the world divides between natives and foreigners, but it's not. And here, actually, in two cases, there were two interesting contexts. One was the context of the super mobile people coming from the Schengen area, mostly, who came here as international students, but out of the sudden they realized that they were foreigners. And the text tells us a lot about that. And the other thing during your comments was that Ukrainian and Belarusian students did not perceive themselves as foreigners here. They were in Polish language programs, so they were Polish, but we treat them as foreigners. So I think that it would be very interesting to develop this category in different contexts, because I think that in post-colonial situations we can also have a different conceptualization and different interpretation of this concept of being foreign. So it would be very nice if our authors put a little bit more thought into this category. And again, I would like to thank you, the authors, for the research, for the study, and for the paper, and Konrad for inviting me to this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janusz, and thank you to all for being with us today and participating in the meeting. There almost 40 persons joined us for the seminar today, and I feel that there are so many other yet questions I wanted to ask, and probably many others, but unfortunately our time is up. It's almost 4 o'clock, so once again, big thank you to our speakers, so Eva, Karolina, David, and Janusz, for sharing your thoughts and your research with us today. And as promised, we'll try to make this recording available on our YouTube channel soon. So thanks once again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for
the question. It was a pleasure.